Good evening. This is DebraVWilson. I'm in Bradford. The date is it's Sunday. The date is the 24th of January 2021, and the time is 1900 hours and 36 minutes. The name of this podcast is Why Are You Going From Meeting to Meeting Taking Notes? What SO15 Officer asked me at Heathrow Airport. As I've said before, and some of this will be a repeat of what I've said in previous podcasts, I started traveling to the UK in my 20s, in my late 20s. I am 63 years old. When I initially traveled to the UK, I came as a tourist. Shortly thereafter, I think within the third trip, I started looking for volunteer work to do. And I found the work through the then Silver Moon bookstore, an all-women's bookstore. And so I would do this temporary work, volunteer in organizations while I was in London. When I first started traveling, I was traveling to London once a year, and quickly it became twice a year. Then it eventually got to 3 to 4 times a year, and periodically I would have extended stays in London. On average, once I started my research, which happened after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and extremism in this country grew, I started traveling 3 to 4 times a year, and I spent about $5,000 to $6,000 per year on travel, on costs associated with travel. It wasn't the airfare, because I was flying out of London, and I could always get some discount on my favorite airline, which is not sponsoring this, British Airways. But it was the accommodation. I could have found cheaper places, but I needed to stay in central London. And the cheapest place I could find that was safe and to my liking, it was a deal in central London. I could walk a lot of places, although I typically took a quick tube ride. So, about my activism, which I've brought up before. So, as I'm talking, I'm writing this down. I come from a business background in Chicago, where I was an accountant, and I did auditing and sometimes forensics auditing, and I've been a human resource person, a personnel person that has sometimes done forensics HR work. And so the forensics accounting and forensics HR work involve research, but general accounting, regular accounting, and HR can involve research. I do love research, understanding how and why a situation came to be. In that light, when the discussion in London around civil society became focused on increasing extremism in London, and my focus was strictly London, I began to seek to understand how the state understood what was happening. So, using government websites, I started downloading reports about the British national security model. So I was only interested in the internal model. So that's led by SO15, the Counter-Terrorism Police, and MI5, the Security Service. Just for the record, MI5, MI6, and GCHQ are all intelligence agencies. So there you go. Gotta keep going now. So I started researching what I read what the state said about itself. Then the next thing my research took me to, was seeking to understand how civil society understood national security, and how they understood, or if they thought, extremism was increasing in London. Again, my focus was London, but quite often people talked about extremism growing in other parts of the country. So I would go from meeting to meeting taking notes. Oh my goodness. I would travel to the UK, fly into London. I had some friends in London and outside of London, but at that time I never traveled outside of London. It was pretty much my focus was London. I would try to catch up with my friends, but mostly I was doing this research, which I found it so fascinating. I was absorbing it and consuming it, and I just loved it. So I was going from civil society to civil society, just looking for these meetings online, word of mouth. One meeting finishes, people talk about there's another meeting happening. And so I would go to the meetings, tell people that's what I was doing. I was seeking to understand things. And I would sit and listen to the speakers and the questions and try to formulate how I understood these people, these civilians, understood civil society. So that gave me a two-dimensional picture. So the state and then civil society. But then I heard about all the extremism, all in quotes, that people were talking about. And I wanted to try my hand at interviewing people who were extreme in their thoughts about London and or the UK. So what I did was I started reaching out to talk to people who had thoughts of harming the country. I found them and they sat with me. At some point, it was probably actually before I started interviewing people who I term as having extreme thoughts. I flew them to the UK like I always did, 3 to 4 times a year. And I was going through, standing in the queue to go through immigration, again like I always did. And I remember looking at people, and the immigration officers that particular day were all seated, and they had on navy blue jumpers with the identifying marks on them. And this one gentleman was standing and had a white shirt on. He was the only one standing with epaulets on his shoulder. I thought he was a supervisor or manager or something. And I remember thinking somebody must have called in sick or late. So actually, as it turns out, I was told to go to his desk. And he starts talking to me, and he said, "Welcome to the United Kingdom, madam." He had a real passport, and I was passing it to him. He opened my passport, and then he asked, "What are you doing going from meeting to meeting, taking notes?" He thought I worked for the U.S. government. I told him, "No, I do not." And I explained to him I was doing research and what the research was on. And he asked if I wouldn't mind sharing it with him, the organization, SO15. Well, I remember thinking, well, that I want to continue coming to this country, and some of the people were critical of the national security model. I was critical of the national security model. Certainly had my questions. So I told him that. He said, "No, we want to hear your comments." He went on to say, uh, he said, "Speak up and make yourself heard." So I'm giving you snatches of the conversation. So I continued to make my way through studying the state, what they were doing, publicly available information, civil society, going from meeting to meeting, getting appointments to talk with people who held extreme thoughts and ideologies. And then I decided I wanted to hear from other people who called London home, if only for a short period of time. I wanted to understand how they understood the experience. Those people were in embassies. They were diplomats in embassies, and they were easy to meet. They were at events, public events, at think tanks, at some of these civil society meetings, places like LSE. Diplomats show up to hear whatever the topic of discussion is. And they were very easy to approach. They're diplomats, and some of them gave me time at the meetings at LSE or we made arrangements to meet for a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and have a discussion. So I collected this information, this research for years, always had transparency. I was always quite transparent in telling civil society, those people that I'm terming had extreme thoughts, as well as diplomats, that I was putting this all together in a report that went to SO15 that would ultimately end up in my research, the basis for my research, because I was planning on and am planning on going back to school. And I wanted a research-based degree to look at my understanding of national security and to see how valid my approach was and to test my findings. I can't describe, literally words fail me to describe how enamored I am with understanding how and why people create and think the way they do when it comes to issues of national security. I think it's fascinating. It's a service of the government. The national security model is a service provided by the government. So it's difficult to have a discussion with spies who are currently active. One hopes, as I do, that I may be able to talk to a retired one or two once I start my research program. But it's difficult to get the currently acting practitioners to sit down and give voice to who and what they are and how they construct both threat and security. I find it fascinating when it comes to civil society, the way it moves and the way it ebbs and flows around issues, the way it diversifies, organically emerging civil society, the way it diversifies and expands and contracts based on when, where, and how, and what they are looking at, and what's moving in the society and the country, the relational dynamics. And my focus was the national security model and civil society. And so that the relational dynamics are fascinating to watch that ebb and flow, like starlings, the birds. It's just absolutely fascinating. The people that I viewed with extreme thoughts that held extreme thoughts, it was sad. It was depressing. Some of the people I talked to were young men. And I always felt sad to hear people not only feel that disconnected from their country, but so disconnected that their thoughts were extremely unpleasant. The diplomats were foreigners, foreign to this country. And it was interesting to hear from a diplomatic perspective how they understood their host country, the UK, was doing its job. It was fascinating. The people were engaging, friendly. So that's the body of work that I'm going to take into my research to test it, go through the rigors of academic learning and questioning, challenging what I think I understand, what I think I know, and what conclusions I will come up with. I'm very excited about it. And when my academic work starts, I'll be posting things here and there. I want to do a bit of a disclaimer. I was born in the U.S., and so I was traveling to this country as a foreign national and doing this work. I do not recommend anyone, and I'm not recommending anyone do this work, because I will tell you the other part of the story to be fully transparent and honest. Just so you know, the volunteer work, fine. Interviewing civil society, fine. Civil society, when I started getting into talking to the extremists, SO15. When I came into the country, I was interviewed by SO15. an enhanced interview, which I didn't have a problem with considering who I was interviewing. And it came to the point that when I left the country, I was always at Heathrow Airport selected for random enhanced interviews before I got on the plane. And so those people, let your imagination be your guide about who interviewed me. But I was always selected for random every time, random and about. And the questions were always the same. What had I done? What brought me to London? What had I done while I was in London? So I had a lot to say what I was done, what I had been doing, what had been accomplished, and there were questions about my work. So I certainly don't want to give you the impression, although no one's traveling very much these days, but I certainly don't want you to give anyone the impression I just hopped on a plane and started talking to diplomats and people with unpleasant thoughts. And Britain said la-di-da, la-di-da, safe journey back to Chicago. I certainly don't want to give that impression because that is not what happened. I was questioned quite extensively about my work and what I was going to do with it. And I was told repeatedly that it wasn't advisable for me to share online the people's names and things, which of course I wouldn't. And that's the other thing, that even though I was doing this not for a job or I wasn't employed by anyone, so I wasn't under any kind of agreement, there's data protection. And I did belong to some organizations and presented my work in those organizations so that my work was covered by data. The people that talk to me, their names are protected under data protection. I certainly am not going to start saying that defining someone as a terrorist or not a terrorist. Again, the people, in my opinion, expressed extreme thoughts and ideology. And I made that very clear, and I was very conscientious about documenting exactly what they said. And again, I did full disclosure and told people that these reports the reports that I put together per trip would end up in the hands of the UK government. So I think that's important to say. I don't know if I want to say a disclaimer as much as I want to say reality. So I'm not recommending this. I'm sharing my journeys of what I did and what I continue to work on and hope to continue to do in this country. And I'm hoping to do some research in Israel. And I'm hoping to again visit Canada, where I can hopefully, as a visitor, at least attend some conferences with some activists and academics that are also working with national security. This is Debra V. Wilson. Thank you very much for listening.